authored thoughtfully. And I think this is one of the key problems and the key tenets that many of us who work in accessibility deal with today is how do we make sure that a lot of these visual design constructs do not obfuscate or obscure the information that we need to provide and deliver? Because there is one significant issue and one huge weakness when it comes to screen readers. They're difficult to use for many users and unremittingly verbose for the vast majority of use cases, even if you skip the main content, even if you skip navigation. For many screen reader users, working with web-based interfaces exacts a heavy cognitive toll. It requires a huge amount of work, and it really results in a great deal of fatigue. Screen readers can be less efficient, and I'll use Georgia.gov as an example of this. This is how Georgia.gov looked back in 2016, 2017, when we first built the voice interface that would revolve around Georgia.gov. Now, Georgia.gov has been at the very forefront of all of these concerns that come about with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, with, of course, making sure that there's alternative text available for all images. But a lot of these things are not really very convenient for screen readers. Links, navigation bars, nav bars, calls to action, form elements, multimedia. A lot of these things require a lot of spelunking up and down and rappelling up and down through these elements within HTML to understand, for example, what the alt text is for an image, or what the caption is for a video element, or what makes up a nav bar if you need to go back and click on a link back there. So screen readers are very inefficient when it comes to working with websites that are very much visually rooted. Chris Mari is a blind technologist who works on voice technologies, and he wrote in Wired Magazine about his experience as a blind user of screen readers. And he writes this: "From the beginning, I hated the way that screen readers work. Why are they designed the way they are? It makes no sense to present information visually and then, and only then, translate that into audio. All the time and energy that goes into creating the perfect user experience for an app is wasted, or even worse." When I read this quote for the first time, it really piqued a lot of my imagination, which is that we spend copious amounts of time as people who work on accessibility into making sure that all of our websites adhere faithfully to WCAG guidelines, that we adhere faithfully to a lot of the tenets of accessibility on the web that we now understand. But what Chris Mari is asking here is a much deeper and much more fundamental question. If the use cases that we're trying to solve, if the requirements that we are trying to enable are things that are fundamentally broken when it comes to these visual underpinnings of the website, why shouldn't we go into a completely different direction? And this is one of the reasons why, of course, Chris Mari is now working on voice technology and working on voice interfaces to solve this problem. Because one of the things that we've seen, not only from our work on Ask GeorgiaGov, the first ever voice interface for residents of the state of Georgia, but also with other voice technologies, is that often well-designed voice interfaces can rapidly get users to their destinations faster than long-winded screen readers can. And a lot of that is simply because of the focus, the change in focus away from building a visual foundation for a website towards instead building an oral and verbal foundation for that same content. So why voice interfaces plus screen readers? And this is one of those things that I always mention. Voice interfaces should never be alone in terms of your strategy for accessibility. And as we know, multimodal accessibility involves the provision of accessible interfaces, assistive alternatives across multiple dimensions of user experience. This doesn't just mean screen readers for web users. It also means voice assistants for blind users, refreshable braille displays for deafblind users, other means of interacting with our content and our transactions on a regular basis. Of course, we're seeing a lot of those ideas begin to percolate through the World Wide Web Consortium, for example, with their new WCAG guidelines, and beginning to understand that it's not just about these visual or physical elements that we have to manipulate. It's also about a lot of these things that go well beyond what screen readers have been capable of from the beginning. And whereas visual interface users can ignore areas irrelevant to them in the viewport, blind users who are using screen readers have to listen to every single utterance. And voice interfaces, for that reason, really should exist in an accessible world in parallel with and alongside screen readers for content delivery and conducting transactions and so on and so forth. So with that, let me move into some of the conversation about Ask GeorgiaGov. And I really wanted to share the case study here because this is a really interesting example of how we endeavored to use our user research, to use our demographic understanding of people in the state of Georgia and people with disabilities in the state of Georgia, and also senior citizens and the elderly in the state of Georgia, to really understand how we could answer their questions at home. One of the things, as we know about state government, and of course local government, city government here in New York City, is that a lot of people are unable to access physical offices. They might not necessarily be as comfortable calling a phone hotline or using a website. So our goal with this project was to really look at how can we make a lot of the frequently asked questions content, which is really the most visited website content on Georgia.gov, available through Amazon Alexa, so that people could have a separate form of access to this sort of content for everyone who needed it across the board. And this really involved, of course, looking at some of the demographics, looking at some of the analytics, and analyzing what are the things that people need from this website content, and how can we deliver it to them in a different way that makes much more sense. But here's a big question, and this is where I move a little bit more into the realm of content. For content strategists and many of us who are on this webinar or this Zoom call today, this meetup today, we interact very often with content that is on a website. And we have to think about how do we make this accessible, not just from the standpoint of the WCAG guidelines, but along other axes of accessibility that really enable and enrich and offer more nuance to people with disabilities and their experiences of our content. But the key question here is, how do you juggle parallel content across screen reader and voice? And there's many articles and many sessions that have been given about how to actually write content for screen readers, not just from the standpoint of ARIA roles and from semantic HTML, but also from the standpoint of how to write content, period. How to write content in and of itself, in the form of copy. For most organizations, unless you have better reasoning, and I share a lot about that within chapter 2 of my book, the really kind of foolproof answer, or the most important and sort of the most graceful answer, is to adjust the existing web content you have so that they're amenable. All of those pages are amenable for both screen readers and pure voice interfaces, in addition, of course, to the web users who do not use screen readers on your website. And there's two key aspects of this that really also apply to screen readers as well when it comes to the usability of screen reader driven experiences. The first is content legibility. Is it understandable to a listener rather than a reader? And the second, of course, which I think is even more important when it comes to voice interfaces as opposed to screen readers, although it is still very much important in screen readers, is content discoverability. Is content discoverable for users who need to interact with conversational flows or dialogue-driven flows rather than clicking on links or following links within the context of a screen reader? In Ask GeorgiaGov, we decided to really mirror the same structured content and the same organization of content, the same hierarchy of content within the Georgia.gov website in order to accommodate the expectations of users who might be using both properties. As an example of this, Georgia.gov at the time, which was back in 2017, had a popular topics section made up of multiple frequently asked questions pages. You can see there are 3 examples here on this screenshot right now: name changes, saving for college, and voting. And all of them had a summary section at the beginning after the topic header with a what you should know bulleted list. And we took the introduction paragraph and the what you should know section, the bulleted list, together as a essential what you should know section for our voice interface. After that what you should know section, we had frequently asked questions items that were organized into question and answer couplets. So you would have a question and then an answer. An example of this is one question could be, how do I transfer my out-of-state driver's license once I move to Georgia? That's a question that makes up the first part of a frequently asked question. The answer would start with the sentence, within 30 days of moving to Georgia, you are required to visit the nearest Department of Driver Services Customer Service Center, and so on and so forth. So we wanted to make sure that this structure was something that could also be implemented and reflected within the Ask GeorgiaGov voice interface. So what we did is we performed a first ever, what we call omni-channel content audit, to examine cross-channel legibility and discoverability. And I'll show just a few examples of what that looked like. This voice content audit that we did for Ask GeorgiaGov was really one of the first times that I worked on a project where we did something that had never really been done before in the industry. We looked for a lot of other examples of this sort of project when it came to content audits. But generally speaking, content audits are really more focused on regulatory compliance. They're really more focused on things that relate to editorial voice. They're also related, of course, to making sure that accessibility is followed in the form of accessibility audits. But there really wasn't necessarily an audit that was oriented towards those who might also be using a voice interface, just solely using the voice interface in order to interact with this content. So we had a table here, as you can see on the page, the document that we used, that had a certain legend with certain items like keep intact, reword surrounding sentence per suggestion, rewrite phrasing of question, needs further discussion, other, and no action needed. And over the course of evaluating all of the content on the Georgia.gov website that we plan to implement within the Ask GeorgiaGov voice interface, we discovered a lot of different issues. And like countless other editorial teams, as we know, especially here in New York City, Georgia had limited funding. They could only manage one single source of truth for content. So in some ways, they were already pushed towards this direction of saying, well, in order to maintain all of these different manifestations of this content, one for screen reader and the website, one for voice, one for, of course, their written chatbot that they have today as well as, of course, other forms of content that may emerge in the future, like virtual reality or augmented reality, Georgia wanted to make sure to have only a single source of truth for all of that content. So what we did is we audited for voice content legibility and voice content discoverability. What that entailed was, well, let's talk about links and calls to action, for example. And I think this is one of the ways that dovetails where screen reader usability dovetails nicely with voice interface usability. As we all know from interacting with Chromevox or interacting with our own screen readers, links can be a little bit of an interesting thing to deal with, an interesting element on the web to deal with when it comes to screen readers. And voice interfaces are exactly the same way. One of the problems with voice interfaces that screen readers do not have is that with voice interfaces, it's very difficult to follow through with a call to action or click on a link. There's no way to color text blue and underline it, or identify a link element within a voice interface unless you build that in as a custom piece of functionality. And then, of course, you might as well be rebuilding certain aspects of the screen reader. So addressing links and calls to action were very important. As an example, I'll read out just a couple of these examples here. One of the questions that we dealt with was about Medicaid. And one of the answers that was on that page was Medicaid has several programs that can help you and your family. Then a link, learn more about these programs. Of course, one of the issues with this whole endeavor is that if you hear the phrase learn more about these programs, not in your screen reader, but rather in your voice interface, you're going to be very confused. And you can imagine a lot of other calls to action that have the same issue, like downloading a PDF or read more or find out. These phrases are really not something that's very meaningful to a voice interface audience. So we changed that text to actually recontextualize the link within the sentence that came before. So instead of Medicaid has several programs that can help you and your family, link, learn more about these programs, we instead said Medicaid has, link, several programs, end link, that can help you and your family. And a lot of these approaches really helped us to reduce the amount of verbosity that we had within our content, and also to help reduce the numbers of calls to action. Because one of the things that has been found over the course of a lot of content strategy over the years is that calls to action really aren't that great for what Aaron Gustafson calls headless UI users or user interface users with where those interfaces do not have a visual component. Verbosity was also a big issue. I think one of the things that we know from working with screen readers as well is that screen readers can be very verbose and they can read out these Russian novels of content. And oftentimes by recontextualizing these links and getting rid of calls to action, we were actually able to reduce the length of a lot of this content. Here's one example. The before state of one of the answers was, the Georgia Lottery Corporation only raises money for the Georgia Pre-K and Hope Scholarship programs. It does not administer those programs. Read more about the link Pre-K program, end link, and the link Hope Scholarship program, end link. Now, after we recontextualized those links and got rid of that read more call to action, the content not only read smoother, it actually shortened the text so that we could link only the first mentions of the Georgia Pre-K and Hope Scholarship programs. So addressing verbosity is, of course, another very, very important issue for a lot of not only the ways in which we can improve the user experience of voice interfaces, but also for screen readers in the long run as well. Voice interfaces have a bit of a different problem, though, and that's, of course, revolving around context and ambiguity. One of the biggest issues of using a voice interface is that you have no screen, and of course, a lot of ambiguity surfaces from context that is settled elsewhere on the page. One example of this is a FAQ topic that might deal with unemployment benefits, but later on the page, you have a question that asks, how long can I receive benefits, without any further mention of unemployment benefits again. Our voice interface for Ask GeorgiaGov involved a search of content, where you would search for a topic and then traverse a tree of content in order to access your question and your answer. So if you're searching for unemployment benefits, there's a lot of ambiguity that gets introduced, because if you don't have a question that's phrased, how long can I receive unemployment benefits, as opposed to how long can I receive benefits, you're going to ask the question, which benefits? Here's another example. One question that we found on our FAQ pages was, how do I start my loan application? But of course, the state of Georgia administers multiple kinds of loans, and this was on the page that was titled, Applying for Environmental Loans and Tax Credits. So we changed that question phrasing to, how do I start my environmental loan application, to be very, very clear about disambiguating those things. Of course, one of the final things that we did in our audit was also to evaluate some of the cross-channel interactions. One thing that we found was that a lot of voice users will interact with not only one, but multiple devices over the course of their work with voice interfaces. For example, you might be using a voice interface while you're scrolling on your phone. You might be using a voice interface while you've got your iPad next to you. You might be scrolling on your phone while you've got some other kind of device next to you as well. So facilitating these sorts of cross-channel interactions was very important. And one example of this is that in those sorts of calls to action, where we knew that there was useful information on a website that was not owned by the Georgia.gov property, we allowed for people to understand that you could go over to that website on your other device in order to potentially get to that device. And this is an example of how we can enable more cross-channel, more flexible, multidimensional, and ultimately, of course, multimodal interactions across all of our devices. One example of this is the before state of this answer was, see the differences between a link, LLC, sole proprietorship, and corporation, end link. Now that call to action was replaced by a little bit more description and a little bit more of a pointer out to that property. So the after state was, not sure which business type meets your needs? Learn the differences between a link, LLC, sole proprietorship, and corporation, end link, in the Georgia.gov blog. A lot of these sorts of compromises were things that we had to evaluate with our team and work with directly with the Georgia editorial team to really understand how these sorts of changes might implicate some of the advancements in user experience that we wanted to see. So for more on this topic of voice content auditing and omnichannel content audits, see Chapter 2 of voice content. And of course, this really dovetails very nicely with a lot of the accessibility audits that many of us do on a regular basis. So 8 months later in 2017, we found that we had some really interesting pieces of data that emerged. We already knew from the very get-go, based on the previous data that we had already gathered with the help of Georgia, that a lot of elderly Georgians and a lot of Georgians with disabilities did not necessarily interact with the website the same ways as other users did. And we found, of course, that we had a 79.2% success rate on all interactions on this voice interface, which was a very, very high success rate at that time, because this was at a time when Amazon Alexa had just been released. And of course, it ended up with 71.2 of all these interactions getting to the point where a phone number was provided. We had an additional feature on our Ask GeorgiaGov voice interface that allowed for somebody to also acquire a phone number at the very end in case they wanted to call that agency. And of course, one of the very interesting things that we found was that the most popular keywords that were searched were very different when it came to voice users versus web users. So whereas web users would search for a different top 3 list here, our most popular searched keywords for a voice audience were totally different. They involved vehicle registration, driver's licenses, and state sales tax, which was a very, very different set of outcomes from what we expected. But of course, what I wanted to end with here in terms of this section is that the only sustainable approach is a single source of truth for content that's reused across channels. And of course, the real kind of kicker though here is, well, with the screen reader, you have all of these issues settled in some sense, right? One of the disadvantages that we identified earlier of screen readers is that you've got this visual foundation. But of course, it comes up as an advantage because you no longer need to worry about how to navigate across these HTML elements, because the HTML elements themselves and the hierarchy of the page itself dictates how you navigate and go through all of the content on the page. But the question when it comes to peer voice interfaces that deal with content is, how do we address issues like navigating spoken content, not written content, and for oral audiences, not visual audiences? It's a very, very different kind of approach. Now, I'm not going to have time to get through all of this content here today, but I will encourage everyone who is here to check out my book, Voice Content and Usability, where you can find in chapters 3 and 4 a full examination of how to write dialogues and how to create effective flows. Let me just skip ahead a little bit here. I see Cameron is already on back on video, probably to give me a time check. So
5 minutes, few minutes, but
yep.
you're good.
Yeah, let me go ahead and skip to the end here. I think this is going to be the more interesting portion. Here we go. So let's talk a little bit about the accessible future of voice content, and I'll leave plenty of time at the end for questions. I'll stay a little extra if we have a bit of time. But I want to just talk a little bit about the accessible future of voice content. As all of you have probably felt over the course of my examination of screen readers and voice content, there's a lot to be gained from the enriching of our content on the web and the transactions we conduct on the web, from providing another alternative to the screen reader that might potentially perform more efficiently than the screen readers that we build for from the get-go on a daily basis. And I want to talk briefly here about the accessible future of voice content framed within the backdrop of the inclusive and equitable future of voice content. And here's the question for those of you who use voice interfaces. When you hear Alexa or Siri speak, who is the person you imagine in your head? Who is the person that you picture in your head, or the voice that you can hear in your head? Because when you hear Alexa or Siri speak, a lot of the issues that come about from conversational interfaces, from voice interfaces being the most human interface of them all, and those biases and those forms of oppression percolate into the voice interfaces that we build. One example of this is that we don't normally personify our websites, unless you remember, of course, the old Ask Jeeves. We don't personify visual and physical interfaces, apart from gimmicky interfaces like Clippy. But we do necessarily personify and anthropomorphize our voice assistants like Alexa and Siri. But what are the implications of this? And what are some of the issues that surface from this? Well, there are several, of course, which is that Alexa and Siri are fundamentally, to the vast majority of their users' ears, well, they sound like cisgender, heterosexual white women who speak with a general American dialect. There's no room for those who speak in other dialects. There's no room for those who might speak using African American Vernacular English, or AAVE. There's no room for those who code switch between LGBTQIA+ and straight passing modes of speech, or those who code switch bilingually between English and Spanish. And of course, there is no room for those who sign, and there is no room for those who also are using other dialects and other forms of speech that we all know within the accessibility community. And so this really generates a huge amount of concern on my part, and I did this in chapter 6 of my book. But voice interfaces must represent the richness of human language. And I don't just mean from the standpoint of how human speech works, from the standpoint of spoken dialects and general American and all of the American dialects that we have, and the ways in which immigrants use language in the US, and the ways in which queer communities use English in the US, and the ways in which communities of color use English in the US. I also mean the fact that it must represent the richness of human language from this of the other form of human speech, of course, sign language, and how we use gestures and physical forms of language to communicate much more meaning than voice interfaces can. So what I want to conclude with here, and I'll jump into a couple of takeaways here, but before I do, one of the things that I would love to see from voice interface manufacturers today, especially those who are building peer voice interfaces, is not necessarily just a means for the Amazon Echo Show or some of the ways in which we provide screens that are attached to voice interfaces. But we also need a means for voice interfaces to be able to read, interpret, and speak in sign language as well. There's a point in the future that futurist Mark Curtis calls the conversational singularity, where voice interfaces will be indistinguishable. They won't be discernible from natural human conversation. But I think one of the questions that we can all agree on is, well, at what cost does that come? And this conversational singularity is a singularity for whom? Because for all those who suffer from systems of oppression, for all those who are marginalized, for all those suffer from ableist systems and structures in society, for all those who suffer from transphobic and queerphobic and misogynistic and misogynoir rooted systems within the context of our society, the conversational singularity will not reflect their forms of speech and their forms of interaction until we see that full dimensionality represented therein as well. I have some major concerns about the conversational singularity, not just from the standpoint of all of the things that we've discussed so far with regard to the ableism and oppression rooted within this notion of a single monoculture for all voice interfaces, but also because it puts at a huge disadvantage all of those who live in the global south, all of those who are frontline customer service workers and operatives who handle our phone conversations on a daily basis. Because if you think about it, who are the first to lose when corporations begin to outmode and outsource a lot of these conversations that people have with customer support teams to voice interfaces that are automated? You lose, of course, the ability to speak with somebody who represents the dialect of English spoken in the Philippines or the dialects of English spoken in Indonesia or in India. And at what cost do those losses in income, of course, come as well? One of the things that I found interesting is that usability research shows that some users perform some more of these artificial sounding or uncanny valley type interactions because they're more rehearsable, they're more practicable, and they don't really root themselves in some of these problematic notions. So a few takeaways for everyone here today. Voice interfaces are the most human of interfaces. They are the most primordial, the most primeval, the most organic of user interfaces that we have today because they reflect at least one form, of course, of human speech that we have within our society. Voice content itself, if you want to actually present voice content accessibly, you have to root that in verbal language and oral flows, not visual structures. Although visual structures do provide that other alternative for those who want to be able to use and interact with content on a website. Voice content cannot stand alone alongside web content. It has to reflect an omni-channel strategy that really encompasses the screen reader, other assistive devices, many other forms of user interfaces as well, especially some of the other devices that we see coming over the horizon, like digital signage, IoT devices, Internet of Things devices, augmented reality and virtual reality, wearable technology, and of course, haptic interfaces and other devices that we'll see emerge here in the future as well. So with that, I'll share some resources here. I'll share these slides out and ensure that I get all this content out to everyone who's attended today. Thank you so much to Cameron and Meryl and the team for having me here today. Last thing I'll say today is check out my new book, Gatsby the Definitive Guide, coming out later this month from O'Reilly. You can get that information at my website, preston.so/books/Gatsby. And over at abookapart.com, you can get my second newest book now, my second latest book now, Voice Content and Usability, the first ever book on voice content. Thank you all so much for having me today.
Preston, thank you so much. This has been enlightening and also in ways for me challenging. So I want to sort of prompt a discussion here, and hopefully you can take another 5-10 minutes. Do you have a hard stop?
4:15 I'll have a hard stop, but yeah, 5-10 minutes
okay.
is
Okay. All right. So one of the things that many of us here as accessibility professionals might have tuned into or cued on with your description of screen readers was this idea that screen readers are basically an abstraction on an abstraction, right? They are a oral interface on a visual interface to some content or interaction. And that's true, and it's the best we have. So I think the question is, what do we do with how do we bridge between a world where things are visually presented and have like some mapping to a screen reader and like a fully voice driven experience? Like, what are the sort of like middle grounds, right? Like, for example, there are things that screen readers do really well that Alexa may never do well, like interaction, interactivity, like rich interactivity with links. You touched on this a little bit, but I guess and this is maybe your point about like being cautious about the singularity of voice. It it's a question of multimodality. Like, how do we reconcile all these different modalities um, when in fact we're very limited in the resources that we can apply to these efforts, right?
Yeah, that's a great. So it's a very broad question. I don't know that I can give a very good answer to that question.
I
But
think
I
you
think
touched on
that
it some, so maybe I can guide the question a little bit around single source of truth, right? So
yeah,
like single source of truth for content is what you described. It's auditing written content for applicability across a voice experience and a visual experience. How do you do that with interaction? What is the shared source of truth um, for a checkout flow or a sign up form?
yeah. So that's a great question. Obviously, I didn't have time to get into the usability research section of the kind of the slides today, but I think one of the things that we need to examine as practitioners in this area is especially those sorts of checkout flows or those sorts of more transactional interactions, which are not necessarily the focus of my book or the topic today. Is to conduct really robust usability testing and
Mm,
ensure that
sure.
a lot of the and this is really where I think content audits dovetail nicely with
Mm,
this distinction between informational versus transactional voice interfaces. Also, with the distinction between kind of transactional interfaces versus content, is that the content audit is in some ways like a usability test for content, right? You read copy, you read text, you interact with media, you really want to evaluate how that content sounds, reads, and is printed. Whereas usability testing is really about, okay, how can we do a usability test that's also omni-channel, is also multimodal, and my expectation, and this is what we actually did for those cross-channel interactions. I wish we had gotten to that point, but those cross-channel interactions that I mentioned earlier, where people often have, let's say, a smartphone plus an Alexa device at home or an iPad plus a Google Home at home, those were some of those interactions that we really played a lot with during our testing, because that's one way that you can get a more holistic perspective and a more comprehensive look at how not only those individual experiences perform, just like we saw with the content audit, but more so, and I think more importantly, how similar or how interchangeable are those experiences with each other. Because the last thing you want, for example, right, is for somebody who has a certain mental model of how a checkout system should work from their interaction with the website to be completely befuddled and confused because that same flow does not in any way, shape, or form mirror or reflect what their expectations are on a voice interface or a
mm,
chatbot. So my answer would be, yes, consider usability testing to be kind of that other analog, and to really look at through your usability testing, your accessibility testing, how much do these experiences match up with each other when it comes to user expectations. And of course, this requires a huge amount of research beforehand as well
mm.
to understand your users very deeply.
Yeah, thank you for that, Preston. I know I want to give you time for your next conversation. The Doug's question is, will you be giving some sort of version of this talk in the future at any point? I know we unfortunately had to truncate some of the slides. So, where besides, I mean, I guess very clearly this slide shows your book. Um, I would encourage Doug to check out the book. But do you have
Yeah.
other opportunities that people can hear you speak?
Yeah, so the first I would say is so yeah, Doug, great question. Please check out my book. It's gonna really have the most complete examination of everything that you're looking for with this content. It is really probably, I mean, there's no possible like I've tried to put a lot of this content into an hour-long talk, but it simply doesn't work. I do have two upcoming talks coming up though that I will mention. The first is an event apart, which is not going to be necessarily about the same topic, but it's going to be really about how to translate a lot of those web elements to voice. And actually, at an event apart in October, there will be another speaker who is talking about screen readers as well and writing content. Writing HTML for screen readers. So I think it's going to be a very interesting set of talks. The second one is Button. Unfortunately, that's going to be a shorter version of this talk. It's going to be only about 35 minutes. That's also coming up in October. And we'll cover a little bit less about accessibility, but more on the kind of user interaction design and some of the usability work that we did, although it's only going to be 35 minutes, so about half the time that I'm spending with you all here today.
Great. Well, I'm gonna call it here, but again, thank you all for joining, and it's been a pleasure having you, Preston. If you don't mind, please share your slides with us, and we'll post them on the meetup group afterwards, if that's all right. Or we can message individuals directly, whatever you prefer. Join us next month for a conversation with Deborah Rue. She's going to be talking about global identity and empowerment for nonprofits around accessibility. Thank you so much for joining us today. Keep an eye on the meetup group, and we will catch you next month. Take care, everyone.
Recording.